All right, gentlemen, we're going to get back into the study. I want to encourage you guys, we have lots and lots of food in there. So definitely make sure that you are eating some of that. Yeah, it's a good thing to, maybe as Grant did, he grabbed a couple extra snacks to kind of keep you focused on protein. So, or Mountain Dew, whatever works for you, to get you going. So we're going to go ahead and get into session 2. Remember, write those questions down so that we can have those for the group time as we go through. We're going to hand out right now the follow along, and just so that Phil knows, we have a Sunday listening notes every Sunday. If I don't give that to them, they get mad, and I get lost. So we have gotten used to that for sure here. So make sure you're filling those in. But if you don't give them the fill in the blanks, they will find you afterwards because they don't like empty spaces. So
I went to a church not too long ago, and the pastor wouldn't let me hand out my listening.
Oh, that's funny.
He didn't think that was scriptural, that believing comes by hearing. And he thought preaching from the pulpit, you didn't use notes. So that was a first new one on me.
There you go. I don't think I've ever done that. If you guys want me to preach without notes, it should be about a 3-hour sermon. So we'll have fun then, right? Yeah.
All right. Let's real quick. I want to ask you if you need a blank filled in on the first outline. So, what was the question Habakkuk asked God? Why do you allow evil? Say that. Why do you allow evil? So, does the world today ever ask, why does God allow evil? Yep. Of course they do. And the answer really is from Revelation and the box. The universe is a box. Now, it's a big box, but God has thrown Satan and his angels down here for thousands of years, and God is allowing evil to exist with good in the box. Someday he's going to separate the two. And what happens in this box, which how long is 1,000 years in God's sight? A day. Yeah. And so we look at it and say, man, this has been going on forever. Abraham lived 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. In God's, that's 4 days. So we have to understand, if from God's perspective, it's not long, but it's going to be long enough, and there's going to be enough evil and suffering and all kinds of things going on that this is going to be evidence for eternity of why there's a heaven and a hell. Does that make sense? And that's what it's all about. Now, that perspective is hard to give people. Yes?
I got a statement about that. Evil. It's free will. Our free will. We can choose evil, or we can choose to believe in God's will.
And that's part of the box. So God put Satan and his angels down here. He put good and evil in here. And he said, I'm going to create some beings that are going to be allowed to choose. And what do we choose? We choose evil.
Most of it.
Now, but God allows us to choose. Now, I'm not going to get into Calvinism versus Arminianism. Does God choose us or do we choose him? I want you to know I think it's both. And I think they can both exist. The Bible says twice, whom he did foreknow, he did predestine. In other words, he knew before it happened the choices we were going to make and if we would choose him or not. So that's a story, a study for another day. But today we're looking at evil. Could I share another story with you? Just for perspective. I want to go back to 2008 one more time. And I understand that I'm sharing stories from my life because that's what I've lived. And you may or may not relate to the story, but I want to share another one. And I think it'll make more sense than we get to session 3. I just told you a story about October 5th, 2008. The book of Habakkuk 3 times. Right before the Great Recession, right before I was going to become the president of the foundation, we had 120 employees. Guess what we had when I got the wonderful job of taking that down to 12. Don't you think that was a lot of fun? And it's an incredible story. You talk about stress. Today the foundation is doing great, but during those years, it was very, very difficult. We didn't know if the foundation was going to survive. Now, I didn't know all this was coming. Are you with me? But God was getting me ready. Well, before October, in April of 2008, I got to go to Israel. Anybody been to Israel? I would encourage you to put that on your bucket list and start saving money and try and do that someday. The only reason is seeing it like brings these stories to life, all right? We went to Israel in April of 2008, my wife and I, along with 2 busloads of people, a busload from seminary people and a busload that the foundation invited, and we got to tour Israel. We flew in to Jordan, which is the nation next to Israel. Now I want to give you a picture. Picture Mexico and America. What happens when you come across the American border? Any changes? Any changes? What about the roads? What about the hotels? Same thing over there. Jordan, I'm telling you, is desolate. The roads aren't well maintained. There's trash. You come into Israel, the highways are just like America. The hotels are like America. It's clean. It's taken care of. And so picture that. We landed in Jordan, but our trip started up on the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel, where Jesus walked on water and did all the miracles. We took a bus up there, and so we've been traveling for 24 hours. We slept a little on the plane, but I am worn out, and it's about 9 o'clock on the first night there, April 15th, 2008. Are you with me? My wife's in bed. She's going to sleep, but my habit is, my routine is I read the Bible before I go to sleep every night. It's a thing that gets my mind off what's going on, and at night is when I read through the Bible in a year, so I'll read several chapters. Well, I'm really not paying attention to what's going on. Why? I'm worn out. All of a sudden, we hear pop, 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 pop. My wife sits straight up in bed and she said, she didn't want to go over there. You know why she didn't want to go? Terrorists. And we thought it was gunfire. I went to the window, pulled back the curtain, and it was fireworks. It was Passover week, the week we were there, and they were shooting fireworks off, and our view was of the Sea of Galilee and fireworks. It was kind of cute. I stood watching. Yes?
About this. So, I live in my bedroom's in a sunroom, so I can hear everything around.
Yeah?
And our neighbors are crazy, so they shoot off fireworks all the time. Like, I'll have, sometimes my family's visiting, like, we had my cousin Kate over in July. He's sleeping on the bottom rung, and he just starts fireworks, and so fun.
It's a scary moment.
It is. Well, these fireworks were going off, and we were in Israel thinking there might be terrorists out there, you know, shooting and stuff. But it wasn't. It was fireworks. So I sat back down, okay, and I said, now, where was I? And I wrote this down in this Bible. That's why I've got the Bible open. I write things in here that happen. 4/15/2008. I wrote this down that day. Where was I? I was at 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 41 to 43. Well, what's that? This is Solomon's prayer in the temple. He's dedicating the temple. It's in 1 Corinthians, it's where he says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways. And he's saying all that, but there's a section in there I'd never noticed before, and this is exactly where I was when the fireworks went off. And God said, Phil, I need to get your attention. Listen, it says, in the future, if a foreigner comes to this land, comes from a distant land because of your great name and prays towards this temple, then hear his prayer and do what he asks. I'm a foreigner. I had come from a distant land because of God's great name. And I went, God, are you trying to tell me something? You know what I did? I was wide awake then. He had to set fireworks off to get my attention because that's exactly where I was when those fireworks went off. I went back and said, now, where was I? And I went, wow. So I went outside, went up to the roof of the hotel. It was probably 6, 8, 10 stories. I don't remember. There was almost a full moon, and I turned toward the south, and I prayed. So what would you pray if that happened to you? Now, I realize those words, they weren't exactly written for me, but it sure seemed to apply to me. And the temple wasn't there anymore. You know that. The temple was torn down, but the temple mound is still there. And God is still great, and Jerusalem is still the city of God. I prayed this simple prayer. Lord, show me your glory and power. Let me see you at work. Use me to impact this world for you with changed lives, a changed culture that occurs in ways that only you could accomplish, and so you receive all the glory. That was my prayer. Now remember, April 2008. Now, guys, I am not in some position where lots of people know who I am, and I'm getting a chance to preach in big churches. I preach in little churches. I work with ordinary Baptists just like you. These are the people I love. These are the churches I love. And so as we continue, especially in the third session, I'm going to give you more of a summary of what God did. But God did some amazing things. I sit on the board of the California Family Council. That's the Focus on the Family affiliate. Jonathan Keller kind of leads that. This is just one story. In 2012, or I think that was the year, that Obama was elected, and Prop 8 passed. Remember Prop 8? That was a proposition that said marriage, changed the California Constitution to say marriage in California is between a man and a woman. Nobody expected it to pass. I got to sit in the meeting with 8 men who had no money, who couldn't even afford to pay the guy in charge of our organization. We were deciding whether to shut the organization down, and somebody said, you know what, I think we need to try and get a proposition on the ballot to define marriage in California as between a man and a woman. And somebody said, we haven't got any money to do that. I said, no, it's not our job to get the money, that's God's job. And somebody else said, well, that'll never pass in California. They said, that's not our job, that's God's job. Long story short, we started that process, got Prop 8 on the ballot. God raised $35 million to put it out in the news, and lo and behold, it passed in California. Now, it was struck down by the courts. That's a whole other story. That's called tyranny, but it passed. So my point is, God got my attention in Tiberias, Israel. I prayed a prayer. That happened in April. The Habakkuk thing happened in October. And the only reason I remember them is because when something like that would happen, I wrote it down. I'm going to tell you a couple more that God did. But God works that way. We look and think, no, God uses Billy Graham. No, God uses so-and-so. No, God uses Peter, and he was a knucklehead fisherman. God uses everybody that's living by faith. Now, what is faith? Faith is believing there is a God and doing what? Look on your outline, the first outline, that right at the top. What's that verse? Without faith, it's impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and he rewards those that diligently seek him. And so diligently seeking him is what David did. That's what every one of you can do, and God can use us through our faith when we do that. Okay? Now, we're going to read again. Now we're in chapter 1, verse 12. Chapter 1, verse 12 of Habakkuk. And somebody read for me verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 1. So I'm in chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 1. This is Habakkuk's second question. Who'd like to read that for us? Verse 12. Okay, so the last verse said, I'm going to stand and wait for God to answer my question. Now let's go back and see what that question is. He says, you're from everlasting. You've appointed them. Who's the them? You've appointed them to judge. Who's the them? Chaldeans, the Babylonians. You've appointed them to judge Israel. Then he says, but your eyes are too pure to approve evil. You can't even look on wickedness. Why do you look on favor at the Babylonians? You hear what I'm saying? He's saying, wait a minute. They're more evil than we are. The Babylonians are worse than the Judeans. Why are you using them? Do you hear the question? And then he says, why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? That's verse 13, the second part. So what's that question? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Yeah. So how would you summarize? Yes, that's it. That's right. So what he's really saying is, why do you allow the righteous to suffer? Okay, so look on your outline. It says, God has chosen the Chaldeans to judge Israel. God's eyes are too pure to look on evil, but the Chaldeans are more evil than Israel. They destroy everyone in their path. They worship idols. That's what they said. They worship their fishnets and stuff. They slay nations without sparing. Why do you allow the righteous to suffer? Have you ever heard that? Or maybe, why do you allow the innocent to suffer? Roger Spradlin said, there's two questions that everybody asks and the Bible never fully answers. Why do you allow evil? Yes, I do. Now remember, I allow evil, I use evil, I punish evil. The second question is, why do you allow innocent people to suffer? Why do you allow the righteous to suffer? Well, and now you have to remember, the question doesn't say innocent, it says more righteous. Why do you allow now, Christians aren't perfect, but we're more perfect than the heathens, and why do you allow them to persecute us and do evil things to us? So it's more righteous. It doesn't say righteous, it says more righteous.
Again, I want to know who's the measuring stick, who's defining that?
Well, Habakkuk is in his day. So let me ask you this question. If God allowed the Chinese to come over and just punish America, which country, now both countries are full of good and evil people, don't get me wrong, but which one, pursuant to the Bible, do you think is more righteous in its laws and stuff? I would argue America is, because we've got laws to protect people. In China, they can put anybody away. But do you think God could allow China to judge America?
Yes.
No question.
Babylonians judge
Exactly.
Israel.
So my point is, you may want to put in the blank, why do you allow the more righteous to suffer? Because his question is, I know he's already said we're evil. Why do I, in my country, I'm seeing all this evil, and God says, I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans to judge you, and he says, wait a minute, they're worse than we are. Why are you going to use them? You see that, what he's saying? Why are you going to use them? So let's stop right here, and I want to see if you have questions or comments about the second question. Why do you allow righteous people to suffer? Remembering none of us are perfect, but we're righteous, aren't we, in God's eyes because of the shed blood of Jesus? But does he still allow us to suffer?
But he warned us of that.
He did.
And that's the whole thing is we can't ask that question if he's telling us, you are going to suffer for my name.
But my question is this. Do you or anybody you know ever ask that question? Do you ever hear that question? Yes.
I'm having a rough time to ask it, but I'm gonna say it, or maybe it's more mistake. But I don't think that we have the right to declare ourselves righteous. So I don't look at it as, oh, I'm more righteous than anybody else because I'm a Christian. Yes, I do understand that in God's eyes
We're forgiven.
made righteous because I'm
Mm-hmm.
forgiven. But I by no means claim that I'm righteous, nor do I believe I have that right. I don't believe that because we are still in a fallen world and we do still sin. And as long as I'm still in a position where I sin,
So let me tell you, what you're saying is absolutely right, but you're a person of faith. By that I mean, you already understand somewhat the principles of this book. A person of, we got a question here and then we'll get back to you. Go ahead.
The question I hear is not why did the righteous suffer, but why did the
Innocent. Well, let me tell you, that's a similar question. In fact, I think it's the same question. Is there any child that's totally innocent? Because the Bible says everybody's a sinner, and they've done wrong, and so they deserve hell just like everyone else. So in my opinion, and Daniel could jump in here, it's just a degree of righteousness. I'm sure a child is more innocent maybe than I am, but he's still not innocent.
Yeah, you got to remember this. In all reality, there's two different, if you will, kind of righteousness that we're talking about. There's actual righteousness that is defined by God. God is love. God is righteousness. There's that righteousness that we can't equate to, which is ultimately what we're going to be judged by. In some of these passages, what they're really expressing, they're speaking to the idea of people that typically do right, the innocent, those that would be considered someone that isn't intentionally doing wrong for their benefit and to the demise of other people. So in Habakkuk, he's actually speaking to the fact that I see this person that did nothing wrong, but yet there's a consequence to them because this person is getting gain.
And that's great, because when Babylon comes and attacks Jerusalem and destroys it, is it just the really evil people that are going to get killed and punished? No, it's going to be a lot of children and other more innocent people that are going to have the same punishment. Somebody else had a question or a thought. Yeah.
I was going to say, I've never heard somebody say, why did they let the righteous, do that? But I have heard individuals say, geez, why is my life so hard? Why does it have to always be hard for me to break out of this? You know what I mean?
Yep, and that's what Everett just said. See, Everett's mature enough in his faith to realize that we're in the box. That even if you're living for the Lord, even if you've been forgiven, even if you are not doing terrible things, you still deserve hell. And as long as you're in the box, you're going to suffer. As long as you're in the box, you could have a child die. As long as you're in the box, you could get cancer. And you didn't do anything to deserve that. It's just a consequence of being in this box where there's good and evil, right? Does that make sense? But Habakkuk, remember, Habakkuk is trying to express, who's he talking to? God, really asking questions that normal people would ask. And those go ahead.
Well, I think it's important for us to understand, even in the overall theme of the BroKon this year, we look at who we say that we are and who we really are and say, well, that only impacts me. Not recognizing all the time that sin has an impact on more than you. It impacts those around you.
That's right.
Whether they're really a part of it or they deserve it or not.
That's right.
The consequence of sin is not just personal, it's even social.
Yep.
And the reality for us, if we don't understand that as men, then we look at what we're doing and say, well, it's not that big of a deal because I'm willing to take that consequence. But we don't understand that it impacts things like our family, our wives, our children, our community as well.
And that's a whole another seminar that I do on being men in the culture. Let me just say this in a snippet. You know what the last verse of the Old Testament, we talked about Malachi, written about 500 years before Christ? He said this, behold, I'm going to send Elijah in the day of the Lord. I'm going to send the prophet Elijah before Jesus comes. And what will Elijah do? Jesus said John the Baptist was that Elijah. So John the Baptist was preparing the way of Jesus, and what would he do? And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest I come and destroy the land with a curse. Now, the curse of failed fatherhood, lack of belief and failed fatherhood, is the curse that you see in America today. You can look in different communities, and when the father is not there with the family, those kids are going to become juveniles. It's chaos. So my point is, yes, when we don't fulfill our roles as men, when we think sports and we think indulging ourselves and whatever it is, fishing, hunting is more important than church and family, the culture will fall apart. And that's what's happening in America today. So our sin has consequences on others, is what the pastor said, and that is so true. Today, we're focused at a much simpler concept. First concept, now here it is, What was the first question? Why do you allow evil? And God's answer was, I allow evil. What's the second one? I use evil and I punish evil. The second question is, why do you allow the righteous? And again, the definition of righteous, nobody's righteous, but somebody that's more innocent than the one that's hurting them. Like if a woman gets mugged on the street, beat over the head and her purse stolen, you could say, well, she wasn't righteous. Well, she was more righteous than the person that hit her over the head. And the question is, why do you allow that to happen? Okay, so that's the question. Now we're going to read the answer. So Job has asked the question, and he's now, chapter 2, verse 1, I will stand on my guard, post, and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may reply when I am reproved. Somebody read, and we're not going to read, I want to just read the portion that gives us the answer. So read verse 2 through verse 4 to start. Just read 2 to 4. Somebody read that. Somebody got it? Go ahead.
The Lord answered me, write down this vision, clearly inscribe it on the tablets, so one may easily read it. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It testifies about the end and will not lie. Though it delays, wait for it, since it will certainly come and not be late. Look, his ego is inflated. He is without integrity, but the righteous one will live by faith.
Okay, so let's go at it slowly. He said, record the vision. Now, what's the vision that he's been giving? That Babylon's going to come down and sweep through the country, going to destroy Judah. Record the vision and inscribe it on tablets. What do you think that means? Write it down. That one who reads it may run. He's basically saying, I need you to write this down, and you need to be telling people about it, because people need to be ready so they can run away from it. And then he says, for the vision is yet for the appointed time. What does that mean? It's going to happen in the time when I want it to. It hastens towards the goal, and it will not fail. That means it's going to happen for sure. Though it tarries, wait for it. What do you think that means? It may not be tomorrow. It's kind of like the second coming of Jesus, okay? Except that was going to be, he said, for it will certainly come, it will not delay. So God says, listen, you're asking me why I allow it to happen. First, I want to let you know it's going to happen. Write it down, tell people it's coming. And he did. He wrote the book of Habakkuk after he had this vision. And then he said, verse 4 is kind of the turning point here, and it's really the answer to the question. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him. Who do you think he's talking about there? I think he's talking about the Babylonians. But it also applies to anyone who relies on himself rather than on God. And Babylon wasn't relying on God. God was just using them as a tool. And then the other half of the verse is, but the righteous will live by what? There's your verse. What, in that one line, what is God saying? Help me out. What's he saying to Habakkuk?
He's saying they're wicked people, and that if we want to practice God's faithfulness in allowing this to happen, and we just have to live by the faith to know that this is going to happen.
Yeah. That's the first part of what he says. Watch for the vision. If you're looking at blanks, watch for the vision to be fulfilled. Write the vision on stone. It is going to happen, so wait for it. And here's what I think and then he says, the righteous will live by faith. Now again, when he says the righteous, we know nobody's perfect. Are we there? He's talking about people that are trying to live for the Lord. And in the middle of everything that's happening, in the middle of the evil in your country, in the middle of the judgment that's coming, if you're trying to serve me, you'll live by what? Faith. And what is faith? Believing in God and diligently trying to serve him. But what if bad things happen? What do? You believe in God by faith and you diligently decide to serve him. What if you suffer? What do? You believe in God by faith, and you diligently try to serve him. The righteous don't live by circumstances. Do you know people that the circumstances that happen to them dictate their faith? How many people know somebody that says, well, I used to believe in God, but I don't anymore because so-and-so did such and such? You know anybody like that?
All of us know somebody like that. I mean, everybody can know somebody who says, oh, I used to go to church.
That's right.
Until my feelings got hurt. Or
That's right.
somebody stepped on my toe, or until somebody made me feel not welcome. Or I think we all have that family.
That's it. I've got a fellow who used to help head up our men's ministry at my church. I got another one that was on our leadership team. They have both decided there's no God. One joined the Church of Scientology and just believes that karma comes and goes and we ought to love each other. The other one has just rejected God, divorced his wife, and got remarried. So, and tough things have happened to both of them. Why is it some people can have very difficult things happen to them and they use it as a reason to get closer to God, and other ones have difficult things happen and they use it as an excuse to get away from God?
That's the enemy messing with them.
Huh?
That's the enemy messing with them.
It is.
I mean, at one point, some of us like take what happens to us and go, okay, well that just means I need more of God in my life. The other people will use it as an excuse to say there is no God.
I want a short testimony, and you all may know it, but I hadn't heard it before. Would you give us in a thumbnail your testimony? Would you do that? Where you came from and how you found God? I need you. He already told you. Well, now listen. He's going to do it briefly, but he told it to me in like a minute, and you already heard he was arrested for bad checks in New York. Did y'all hear that? I was hoping that was the lie. I said, I hope that's the lie, and he said, no, that's the truth. So how did you get from there to here?
Okay, well,
Real briefly.
I was a drug addict,
Drug addict?
and I was using drugs for like 20 years of my
20
life.
years?
And I was living under a bridge, and this guy came under there and asked me to go to church. At first, I didn't really want to, go, and so I told him no. And then I needed something, so he left me his phone number, and I called him, and he brought me it. And again, he asked me to go to church, and I said no. And that's when I heard a voice in my head say, "Who are you playing, me or him?" And I kind of just like gave up then and went to church and got saved.
So, I don't have that kind of testimony. You talk about a life turned around. You could easily be dead today on the drug trail. You could easily still be homeless or a mess. So the question becomes, why is it some people have faith and others don't? I don't have the answer to that. That's the gift of God. God draws people to him. God speaks to people. But I think there are people, even when God speaks, say no. Yes?
A lot of it is this flesh is built. There's no doubt about
That's
it.
it.
It's the spirit that lives inside us that brings us closer to God and gives us, allows God to give us that grace that in his eyes makes us holy, set apart.
That's right.
But inside the mind, a lot of people don't think they're worthy of God's grace.
That's right.
And if you don't think you're worthy of God's grace, even in the flesh, I mean, you're right, you're not.
You're not.
Right back to Everett's question, too. You're not. But at some point, we have to come to the conclusion God is for us if we believe in him and diligently
Seek him. There you go.
If we do that, God is for us, regardless of the flesh.
That's right. There's no sin God can't forgive. What God wants is somebody to humbly say, Lord, I can't do anything. I need you. You got to seek him.
I think that a lot of us get touched because other people who know us and know what we're going through in our deepest, darkest pits are praying for us. I do. I think a lot of every person
Yep.
in this room has come to Christ because you've had a grandmother or some person who was on their knees reaching the throne room to heaven with their prayers. You're here for that.
And by the way, that's that spiritual realm. If we could see prayers, if we could see the Spirit, if we could see the demons, we would pray a lot more. But we can't. And so it's hard. Faith is something that takes diligence. And diligence implies effort. Okay? Yeah.
In the example you shared about the two men who were in the church, with John, going back to 1 John, if you're in the light, you're in the light. If you didn't have it in the first place. So if they were that easily swayed, were they even there in the first place?
Well, 1 John says this. They went out from among us because they were never really part of us. You can find that verse in 1 John. They went out from among us because they were never really born again. Because I believe someone who's truly born again may wander, may ebb and flow, but Jesus says, I'll never let go of them.
Doesn't that describe the sower and the seed?
Yes, it does. That's the parable of the sower and the seed, as far as I'm concerned. Jesus said sometimes it sprouts up a little, but it never really takes root. It's a good idea in their head, and they try it for a while, but they're not born again. Yeah.
And it's important, especially as we're talking about what you're talking about here right now. So remember, in the midst of that, those people usually that do have that genuine faith, understand what Everett was talking about, in and of themselves, they're not righteous.
That's right.
They're not righteous, but there's an intentional act that happens because they're trusting God despite their circumstances,
Right.
not because of their circumstances.
There you go. We can't let the circumstances dictate our belief in God, because we're in this box, and our circumstances are not just, God allows things, bad things, terrible things. I got a friend whose daughter graduated from college. She's going to be a nurse. She's going to start her first job, and she gets killed by a drunk driver. Now, where do you see the justice in that? Let me tell you something. My friend worked at the foundation. I went with him to the sentencing for that young man who killed his daughter. The young man standing there, handcuffed, wouldn't face over here where my friend and his wife and others spoke, because they were allowed to speak at the sentencing. My friend got up there and said, I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, and I've already forgiven you. And he said, I have to forgive you. He said, I'm not going to forget. You took the most important person out of our lives, my daughter. But I forgive you, and I want you to know I'm forgiving you. And I want you to live in place of my daughter Molly for Jesus. And that prisoner sat there like this with tears going down his face, and when the judge asked him through an interpreter, do you have anything to say? Here's what he said, I don't deserve your forgiveness. Now, does God work in a situation like that? Now my friend has started Molly Day in Fresno, where people do random acts of kindness every year on Molly's birthday. He started a scholarship fund. It's at the colleges. And so my point is, did he deserve to have his wonderful Christian daughter get killed by a drunk driver? No. But we're in a box. And from God's perspective, where 1,000 years is as a day, precious in the sight of God is the death of his saints. Why? He opens the lid of the box and says, come on home. We have such a hard time grasping that because of this, because we don't have these. Are you with me? And we have to pray. And that's why Paul prayed for the saints. Give them spiritual sight. Give them spiritual eyes to see. And he was basically praying that, Lord, in the middle of what's going on, help them to see that, yeah, they're in a box with Satan, lots of bad things happening, but I'm working out my purposes. Are you with me? I need two verses read. 1 Peter 2:20. Who will look that one up? And 1 Peter 3:17. 1 Peter 2:20 and 1 Peter 3:17. We're talking about suffering. These are two of the best verses about suffering that I know. Anybody got 1 Peter 2:20? It's almost to the end of the Bible. Somebody summarize what that just said.
Saying that basically you allow yourself to go through something that, and you endure it, that literally is going to bring favor
With God. And it said first, if you do something wrong and get punished for it, who cares? You deserve it. But if you do what's right and suffer, and you can endure that patiently, that finds favor with God. When you can suffer, even when you're doing right, it finds favor with God. Another comment on that verse? It's exactly what Jesus did. Read the other. Who's got 3:17? Somebody have that one?
And if it is the will of God that you should suffer, it is better to suffer for doing right than for doing wrong.
What did the first line say?
If it is the will of God
For what?
for you to suffer.
Now, wait a minute. Is it the will of God for you to suffer? Somebody said something about, who said something about Jesus? Jesus never did a thing in his life wrong, and so everything went perfect for him. He lived in a mansion. He had a gold chariot, right? No, wrong. What happened? He suffered. And the Bible says he was perfected through his suffering. Somebody earlier said, God can use suffering to make us better people, right? And this verse says God doesn't just allow suffering, it's his will. Wow. Is that the world's perspective on suffering?
No.
No. The world looks at suffering as the very worst thing that could happen to anybody because we're thinking about this. And in God's eyes, suffering's not the worst thing. Suffering is the thing that can bring us closer to him. Now, it's what? Separation from God would be worse. Have anybody read biographies? I read one about a Russian young man that was born the same year I was. Sergei Kordakov. He was raised in Russia the same time I did. Anybody read that book? I read it to my youth group when I was a youth pastor because it talks about a young man who grew up in Russia. His father was, one day they came and took his father away and they never saw him again. And he grew up as a Christian in Russia, watching people be persecuted and seeing God at work in the midst of that whole mess, okay? And you talk about a different perspective. The more they were persecuted, the more they sensed the presence of God. Do you think that's happening in the world today? I want you to know it is. In parts of the world, you know where Christianity is thriving? Is it in America? Africa. It's where they're being persecuted. China. The church, there are more Christians, they say, in China than there are in the North and South America. They're underground Christians. Why is it Christianity thrives amid persecution? What about the early church? Did they have a lot of prosperity? No. It's prosperity that kills Christianity.
I think that's because if you're being persecuted, especially in the way that China or Africa, you have nothing left.
But to turn to God.
Only but God.
But let me tell you this. I think you sense the presence of God and the reality of God becomes more real when you don't have as much possessions and stuff. So look at this. Now these are my three things. God allows suffering. Is that a fair statement? Remember, we're in the box. He allows evil and he allows suffering. God uses suffering, just like he uses evil. Didn't that verse tell us that? Now what's the difference? When we're talking about righteous people suffering, does he punish suffering? No. God rewards suffering. Righteous suffering. Are you with me? God allows evil, God uses evil, God punishes evil. God allows suffering, God uses suffering, and God rewards righteous suffering. Now, is that the perspective most people in America have? No. We are so caught up in the prosperity of America, and we're wearing these glasses instead of these glasses. I would love to be at a church and have spiritual glasses and watch people come in. You're going to see some big guy walk in like this, but when you put the glasses on, he's spiritually like this. And you're going to see some old lady who can hardly walk in there, and you put the glasses on, and she's the buff, cut, spiritual. What's that? Person. Yeah. And we've got to train ourselves to look at the world that way. Now, we need to hurry on. That's the essence of what he says. But God identifies two types of people in verse 4. What are the two types of people? Verse 4. What's that? The proud and the righteous. Now, obviously, I told you I have an issue with pride. All of us do. But by righteous, I mean those that believe in God and are diligently trying to seek him. Right? I don't mean somebody who's perfect. But he says the righteous in the middle of evil and in the middle of suffering is going to live by what? Faith. That's right. You can't see it. You can't totally understand it. But you're going to believe there's a God and you're going to diligently seek him. And the verse says, the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live life by faith. Now listen, the rest of this chapter, for the most part, and we're going to fly through it, is about the proud. God is going to tell Habakkuk, I know I'm using Babylon to judge Israel, but let me remind you of some things. So turn the page real quick, and I mentioned to you that this verse, the righteous will live by faith, is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. And here they are at the top of the back page. I'm going to turn there, and you can turn if you want, but I'd rather you just listen as I read the context. Here's the first time Paul quotes this verse. And I'm going to find my notes. Here we go. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. Listen to that. For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. For in the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous man shall live by faith. Did you realize those 2 verses were together? You probably all heard the verse, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. No wonder that's muffled. I put it on backwards. No, it's not. It's there. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Paul is talking about, in God's eyes, who are righteous? Those who've been saved, believed in Jesus. For in the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, the righteous will live by faith. When Paul quotes this verse in this setting, he's focusing on the word, the righteous. How do you become righteous? I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power to make you righteous. Okay, so on your outline, righteousness from God through the gospel. That's the focus. Now let me read Galatians 3:1. This is the second time that Paul mentions this verse. Just listen and see if you agree with what I say. Galatians 3:11. I'm going to read 10. For as many are the works of the law under a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them. Now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident, for the righteous man shall live by faith. Paul is talking about how we should live. And he's saying people tried to live by the law, to live by keeping rules, and were people able to do it? No. And he's again talking about the gospel, that no one's justified by the law before God, but the righteous man, the one who's believed in the gospel and accepted Christ, shall live by faith. The focus here is on the shall live. Does that make sense? Let me give you the third one. We don't have a long time to stay here. So right living from God through the gospel. Righteousness from God through the gospel is the first one, but right living from God through the gospel. And then Hebrews 10:38. 10:38. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with a sword, they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and caves and holes. So I read those verses. This chapter is talking about people from the Old Testament that tried to live for God and were persecuted, all the persecutions they went through. Now let me read this in verse 13. It says this: all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles in the world. And that's the wrong verse. For yet in a very little while, for you have, I was in the wrong chapter, chapter 10. For you have need of endurance, so that while you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. This is focused on faith. It's Hebrews 10 and 11, focused on faith. It's not focused on so much on who the righteous are. It's not focused on how they shall live. It's focused on the whole issue of faith. What is faith? He who shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. What does that mean if you shrink back?
Go back to where you came
Not living in faith is what it's talking about. Instead of you get in trouble, there's suffering, there's hard times, there's evil, and you shrink back, you're not living by faith. You're not worthy of the kingdom of God. There you go. Not looking forward. As you look at this chapter of faith, every one of these people he talks about looked forward. Think of Abraham. God said, if you'll go to the promised land, I'll give it to you. So what did Abraham do? What did he do? He had a vision and he went forward. What about Moses? If you'll go back, I'll lead the children of Israel. So Moses had a focus. All these people had a focus on the future. Does that make sense? They had a vision from God for life. The third one, we're strangers on earth, but right plans from God through the gospel. So Paul focuses on this verse 3 different times in 3 different ways. He says, first of all, your righteousness comes from God through the gospel, right? Second of all, he says right living comes from God through the gospel as he lives through you, and even right plans, a vision for how you're going to live your life by faith. You're going to live by faith comes from God through the gospel. Are you with me? Now that's an aside just on that one verse. And remember, that's the verse that God used to motivate Martin Luther to rebel against the Catholic Church and start what we know as the Protestant Reformation. That you don't get to heaven by paying money to the Catholic Church indulgences. You don't get to heaven by saying so many Hail Marys. You get to heaven by faith. Faith in the gospel.
Real quick, a side note on the history of that as well, it plays into what we're talking about. The reason that they believe, there are 2 things that the Catholic Church believed at that time required the need for indulgences. So what just the general sense of what they believe is that we were not all going to be righteous enough that make it to heaven right off the bat. There's going to be a purgatory time. And that's kind of a punishment or consequence time before we get to heaven. But there are some that are so righteous that not only did they go right to heaven, they had extra righteousness. And so Mary and James and you know any of the apostles, Paul, they had extra righteousness. And so what you could do is you could pay to the Catholic Church these indulgences that would get your loved one out of purgatory sooner.
Okay.
So what's kind of interesting about that is that, again, it comes back to the fact that Mary had earned so much righteousness. She was so righteous in who she was and what she did. We can give you some of her righteousness. Whereas that's
Well, no, we're going to sell you some of her righteousness.
No, really they were doing it to build their cathedral. But the reality is that the perspective is that it was about what you did in those moments, or what they did and what you did, rather than what God did as we're seeing here. So,
Good.
just kind of a little side note.
Now we're going to fly through the rest of this chapter. I want you to know what we've already read is the answer. The only answer God gives Habakkuk to his question is, why do you allow the righteous to suffer at the hands of those that are less righteous? God says the righteous are going to live by faith. That's what he says. The rest of this chapter is about the proud. Remember the verse 4 says, behold, for the proud one, his soul is not right within him. Now let's go to verse 5. And as I read through the rest of this, there are 5 woes. What's a woe? Woe to him who? What does that really mean? A warning. It's a warning. Man, bad stuff's going to happen to the person that does this. Bad stuff's going to happen to the person. Woe, woe, woe. Watch for the woes as I read this. This is all about the proud. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man. What's a haughty man? It's a proud man. Huh? Well, it could be angry, but haughty has the idea of self-importance, and you can get angry at others, and oversized ego. So that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. Let me stop right there. What a description. Do you know people that start indulging themselves? What happens when you start indulging in drugs or alcohol? What does it do if you just keep indulging? You get addicted. He enlarges his appetite. Is it ever satisfied? We were talking earlier, when depravity starts, let's make homosexuality legal. Then let's allow them to have partners and recognize it. Then let's allow them to get married. Then let's allow them to start teaching it to children. You see what I'm saying? It's never satisfied. It just keeps going and going. It says, and he is like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all people. What does that mean? He wants his ideas. He wants to control everybody else and make sure they believe the way he does. You see that happening? Yeah. 6, will not all of these take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, now here's the woes. He's saying all the righteous people, all the people that have understanding, are going to look at someone who's like that, proud, arrogant, haughty, and indulging himself. They're going to look at him and say, don't you realize you're blind? You don't see this. Now watch. Number 1, woe to him who increases what is not his, for how long, and makes himself rich with loans. Okay? Somebody that's greedy. Woe to the greedy. That's what this verse is. Here's what's going to happen to him. And makes himself rich with loans. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them, because you have looted many nations. All the remainder of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the towns and all its inhabitants. Let me stop right there. Babylon, he's talking about, came in, and they just want to take over everything. What happened to Babylon eventually? Do you know? It was conquered by Assyria. And what about the city of Babylon? It became desert. It's never been rebuilt. And so this woe that he is pronouncing is against all proud and haughty men, but it's specifically about Babylon. Second woe, verse 9. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many peoples, so you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. Now, there's not a specific word there. What do you think it amounts to? Can you give me a word for what he's talking about? He gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. The stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. What's he doing? Stealing. Okay, stealing is a good word for it. Or dishonesty. So just put a word in that blank. Third woe. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that peoples toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? Stop right there. So who's he talking about there?
Murderers.
Bloodshed. Yeah. Violence or murderers. People who gain by violence or murder. Yeah.
No, I was there.
New York.
I'm going to go to verse 15. It's the next woe. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. Wow. You ever know anybody that uses alcohol and drugs to get somebody so drunk that they can take sexual advantage of them? That's what it's talking about. Verse 16, you will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the towns and all its inhabitants. So what woe would you put there? Immorality. Immorality, Woe to the immoral. I think that's what it's talking about, is the immoral. Now, as a part of that, it says in verse 18, what profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image, a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashioned speechless idols. That's kind of thrown in there to say the people that do this claim to have a God. They may claim to believe in a God, but the God isn't changing their lives at all. Here's the next woe, the fifth woe. Woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise, and that is your teacher. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside it. So woe to what?
Idols.
Yeah, the idolater. Idol, A-R-A-T-E-R. So basically he's saying, woe to the thief, woe to the greedy, woe to the violent, woe to the immoral, woe to the idolater. And all of those things describe what nation? Babylon, the Chaldeans that are coming. And he's saying to Habakkuk, yes, I'm using these people, but their day's coming too. Why? Because of the first principle? Yeah, I allow evil, I use evil, but I punish evil. And Babylon will be punished someday. I'm going to use them now, but they'll be punished someday. Now, we skipped 2 verses, and in the middle of this, I call this a diatribe. Do you think that's overstating it? It's a diatribe against evil people. Whoa, 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 whoa. In the middle of it, somebody read verse 14. Just read that one verse.
For the country shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh, as the waters swell the sea.
Wow. How does that fit in the middle of this? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters that cover the sea.
I think it's talking about the church.
God uses his church to spread his knowledge. I think he's in the middle of all this mess, all the evil that's going on. He's reminding Habakkuk there's going to be a day when the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord. The glory of the Lord is the waters that cover the sea. Someday, this is going to end. It's a perspective verse. Does that make sense? There's going to be a day when evil is not allowed. There's going to be a day when everyone is going to know that I am who I say I am. And the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth. Why is that a necessary perspective for a person of faith? Did you hear my question? Why is that verse necessary for those of us faith? Exactly right. We've got to live, we've got to endure today because we have a hope that something better is coming. And think of Habakkuk. Do you know what actually happened to Jerusalem, by the way, when the Babylonians came? You know what they did? They laid siege for 1.5 years, built walls against it until the people were eating their own children. You know this. They were drinking their own urine. That's how bad it was. They were eating their own children. And then when they conquered the city, they slaughtered tens of thousands of people. They killed babies. They ripped open pregnant women. They bashed the babies' heads against the rock. Now, we're talking about terrible, terrible stuff. And Habakkuk knew what those Babylonians did. He had been hearing about what they were doing to other nations. And the false prophets in Judah were saying, that's never going to happen here. This is Jerusalem. This is God's temple. That'll never happen here. But Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Habakkuk and others were saying, yes, it can, and it's going to. Jeremiah kept telling them that you should just surrender. If you'll surrender, because God's using, if you'll just surrender, then he'll treat you well. But if you fight him, he's going to kill you. But they didn't believe Jeremiah. Habakkuk tells them it's going to happen, and they don't believe him. Habakkuk knows they don't believe. He knows it's going to happen. He knows he's going to have to live through it. And how is he going to live through it? The righteous shall live by faith. And part of that faith is knowing who wins in the end. Knowing that this is temporary. Someday it's going away. Now the other verse is verse 20. Okay, so on your outline, God wins. In the middle of all this, he reminds Habakkuk, I win in the end. Somebody read verse 20 as we conclude. Verse 20.
When the Lord is in his holy temple, and all the earth be silent before him.
Wow. That seems like a really strange thing. Here's all these woes, 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 and then he says, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. What temple do you think he's talking about? Is he talking about that building in Jerusalem? No, he's talking about God in heaven. And we're in this box, and part of faith is remembering God wins, and remember through everything that goes on in here, God is in his holy temple, and he's in control, and that's what you fill the blank in. God is in control, still in control. Okay, those are the first 2 chapters of Habakkuk. That's the 2 questions and the 2 answers. Our next session is going to be where you need to come up with an insight about what we studied, or a question, right, Pastor? A question about what we've done, the question time? Okay, and the pastor will lead that.
And so after the group session, we may shorten that a little bit to get back on schedule.
Okay.
But I would encourage you guys to take advantage of that time to talk through some of this stuff as well, because there's been a lot we've gone through.
Yes, it is.
So, but let's do a bathroom break right now.
Okay.
And then we'll come back together for our group time.
And then our final session is going to be the 3rd chapter. And remember, the book is 2 questions and the answers, and the 3rd chapter is Habakkuk's response. How does a man of faith respond when he sees the evil, he sees the suffering, and all those kind of things? How should a man of faith respond? That'll be our final session.